I am Frank Schumpert, your host, and you are listening to the Empires of History podcast, the Ottoman series, Episode 10, Part 1, A Crusade Dies at Nicopolis. Please stay tuned to the end of the show for news, other podcast recommendations, and how you can support the show. In Episode 9, we left off with King Sigismund of Hungary laying a ton of groundwork and drumming up support for a crusade in Western Europe. Also in that episode, I mentioned Sultan Bayezid's return to Europe after his Anatolian campaign. However, in that episode, I never really got a chance to explore the broader strategic implications and forces at play in Sigismund's efforts, and thereby shine some light on his motivations to stop Ottoman expansion. Jason Goodwin, in his Lords of the Horizons, describes the Ottoman Empire as having a shrinkage effect upon their European neighbors. When the borders of the empire came close, they caused massive destabilization within the affected territory. In Hungary's case in the 1380s and 1390s, the immediate effect was the hated Akinji raiders, after the defeat of the Bulgarians under Sultan Murad I, felt most especially with the arrival of Bayezid back in Europe in 1392. The Akinji, the irregular horsemen from Turkish Anatolia, would raid in groups of 20 to 50 men, yet always in contact with one another so that they could muster forces in stubborn places, were taking a toll on Hungary. Riding in the early morning hours, totally unexpected, the raiders would attack small villages, killing old men and carrying off the women and children, to be deposited in makeshift camps in the Ottoman territory, and then sold as slaves and servants within the empire. It was a sad and terrible fate, striking like a plague, and suffered by high and low alike. Historians think that from the 1350s going through the 1690s, it is estimated that a total of no less than 750,000 women, young men, and children were kidnapped by the Akinji and carried off to a fate of servitude in the fields, harems, galleys of ships, and household servants. Thinking of the inhumanity to man, the exploitation, coercion, and awful component of sexual assault that accompanied these raids, one can feel a collective shudder in studying the historical sources. As so it goes that history is often written by the victors, the silent brooding and experiences of the common folk are lost in a void of despair. This terrible human tragedy caused devastating effects on the Hungarian economy. Medieval Europe was, at the time, a largely agrarian economy dependent on good crop yields and strong harvests to support the societies they sustained. When the Akinji struck, or even just the rumor of the nightmarish riders having been spotted somewhere in the distance, entire towns, villages, and more importantly, fields were left abandoned. Crops were wasted or rotted away in silos, with the peasants too terrified to transport their yields outside the towns. Thus, entire agricultural lands within the Hungarian kingdom were left fallow as peasants flocked to larger towns and cities with high walls in which to hide and seek safety. But this had another effect of significantly increasing social pressures and the tight labor markets controlled by guild rackets. With the abandonment of lands came not just severe food shortages and forced rationing, but a loss of tax revenue for the crown. With this loss in revenue, another cascade effect for the king was that it invariably meant the local barons became very discontented, with seemingly every one of them a claim on the throne via some long-forgotten marriage a century ago to this or that cousin. The barons never let a story of a particular brutal Akinji raid go to waste, and they pressed the king for either more autonomy, more troops for protection, although of course they never volunteered to pay for them, or more of a say in national matters normally reserved for the Hungarian crown. King Sigismund also had to keep a very close eye on his barons for another ominous reason. As part of the Ottoman strategy for invading and conquering a territory, They would frequently leave the ruling establishment alone, along with most of their lands and titles, provided they converted to Islam and joined the Ottoman administrative apparatus. The closer the Ottoman border came to Hungary, then the jumpier his barons became, and Sigismund knew that given half a chance, and with an Ottoman army bearing down on them, his lords would desert him and defect in a skinny minute. Another factor in his shaping of a defensive security strategy against the Ottomans was the simple fact Hungary was not a homogeneous entity by any means. The kingdom encompassed many different ethnic nationalities and religious sects, the most striking of them being the sharp divide between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholics. As the Ottomans invaded lands, they frequently left the Orthodox Christians alone for the most part, and when a territory was settled and taken over, ordered the Christians who remained to become Orthodox if they didn't choose Islam. The headship of the Christians, the Ottomans officially recognized, was the Patriarch of Constantinople, as the sultans never seemed to acknowledge the popes in Rome as having real authority. This caused the Hungarian noblemen, against the wishes of Sigismund, to treat their Orthodox neighbors and peasants as a dangerous fifth column that their Catholic God had ordained that they be beaten down into submission. So it was that the King of Hungary was facing a domino of terrible events as a result of the Akinji raids, the drop in agricultural production, abandonment of entire southern provinces, economic stagnation, and social tensions in the towns and cities, shifty bearings, and the ever-present threat Sultan Bayezid could appear on his border with the Ottoman army. Given the same grim reality, Byzantine had sought to placate the sultans, but look how that had turned out. Serbia and Bulgaria tried at first paying tribute, but it wasn't until literally half their kingdoms had been swallowed up by the Ottoman mammoth that they decided to fight. And by then it was almost a foregone conclusion, and each time the Battle of Kosovo and the numerous engagements in Bulgaria had ended in defeat. King Sigismund realized the only thing that could save the Balkans from total domination was a full-blown crusade, as we discussed in episode 9. To achieve this, he launched a two-pronged attack, the first militarily against the Ottomans indirectly to bide himself some time, and the second a massive diplomatic offensive to the other great powers of Western Europe. Sigismund moved against Bayezid militarily by using the old great power trick of invading weaker, smaller neighbors and setting up client states with a puppet ruler meant only to serve as a buffer state between himself and the Ottomans. From 1392 to 1395, Hungarian armies invaded and raided, first northern Serbia, not under the direct control of Prince Stefan Lazar, who was still very loyal to the Sultan, then into Bosnia, which was virtually a part of the Ottoman Empire. The king invaded Bosnia with his army, and the local Ottoman governor fled. Once securing the southwest, Sigismund marched in Wallachia and Moldova, and put clients on the thrones in those respective kingdoms as well. In what historians like to call the Ottoman-Hungarian Wars, this can be a very confusing stage. Numerous sources often contradict themselves, as clients changed hands as frequently as the seasons. Wallachia switched allegiance first to Sigismund, then, after a pretender overthrew the lord set up by the king, to the Sultan in 1394. Then Sigismund was obliged to march an army back into the territory and depose the pretender, putting his client back on the throne. And on the story goes for some 5 years between 1392 to 1395. Although the Sultan proved effective at countering this part of Sigismund's plan to thwart the Ottomans, the intent was only to occupy Bayezid and keep his forces tied up for the time being. This strategy had the added benefit of keeping the Akinji in military service in the Sultan's army, and not free to roam around causing havoc. While the Sultan was thus occupied in countering Hungarian action, a change in the air occurred in Constantinople in the south. When Manuel returned with his men from the campaign in Anatolia, His troops spread around stories of the Sultan's barbaric behavior. They spoke of the Sultan breaking all sorts of truces, alliances, and marriage contracts, simply to enrich himself and grab land from the poor Muslim lords. One can only assume, of course, that the veterans omitted the part they played in the numerous atrocities committed on the campaign. Their return had a sobering effect on the capital, and pretty soon old political divisions and petty imperial jealousies were put aside in favor of finding a solution to their dire military situation, divisions that had only too well served sultans past. The result was a politically unified city around the emperor, and they began to make repairs to the surrounding fortresses and walls of the great city. Several mosques that had been built within the city by order of the old Sultan Murad I were torn down and the Muslim inhabitants expelled. The Sultan was outraged when news reached him somewhere in Wallachia that the Byzantines were rebuilding their city walls and had demolished the mosque. Bayezid marched with a small army right up to the city gates and demanded entry in late 1395. When he was refused, he ordered a fortress be built at the narrowest point of the Bosporus, less than 3 miles north of Constantinople, to control ships passing along the Golden Horn. It is known today and can still be seen as the Asian castle on tour guides. Constantinople was placed under a blockade that lasted from 1394 till the Sultan's death years later in 1402. This is sometimes called the First Ottoman Siege of Constantinople. King Sigismund had managed by the year 1396 something no other European power had been able to achieve. The Ottomans were firmly on the defensive. Although on paper Bayezid won every engagement, and there were several small-scale battles I simply don't have time to get into, but are sure worth looking into if you are interested, it seemed as though the initiative was finally swinging to the Christian side. With the Sultan thus kept busy playing catch-up to Sigismund, the king set to work the entire time on his master project, building a crusade. A great obstacle to the king's ambition of launching a crusade to repel the Ottomans were something the Byzantines and Bulgarians faced when their attempts had failed. The three major powers crucial in any campaign, of England, France, and the Dukes of Burgundy, were engaged in what we'd call the 100 Years' War. The war had the effect of draining royal treasuries, so that the last thing anyone wanted to do was spend money on some crusade they'd probably never be paid back. However, luck played into Sigismund's hand when the three crucial developments occurred in Western Europe that would eventually enable the creation of the king's long sought-after military expedition. First, King Richard II of England and King Charles VI agreed to a treaty whereby the daughter of Charles, Princess Isabella, would wed Richard with the aim of securing lasting peace. This occurrence meant that the Duke of Burgundy, whose military and financial resources were considerable, were now freed up, and the Duke could pursue matters away from France. Together, the Duke of Burgundy, Orleans, Lancaster pledged support for a crusade. Second, although the power of the popes in the 14th century were significantly reduced from what they had been during the heyday of crusading Europe, the pope's call was still powerful and heeded by a great many. Pope Boniface IX, at the behest of Sigismund's envoys, officially declared a crusade against the Ottoman Empire in 1394. This allowed the various European states to assume special powers over revenues and property, and get about setting up the logistics for a vast military expedition. Third, one of the biggest obstacles to any large-scale military campaign like a crusade were the local powers in the theater of operations. Put it like this: if the Venetians didn't see it in their interest to help transport crusading armies, they wouldn't loan out their vast navy for the enterprise. Same with the Genoese. Therefore, a nascent crusader army could oftentimes be stopped in its tracks before it even got on the march, without the promise of naval transport and supply. Once arriving in said theater of operations, it was therefore vital that the local powers, be it Byzantine, Serbia, Greece, and the like, be united in their support. However, with conflicting loyalties, uncertainty as to the Crusade's ultimate objective, past leaders attempting to put together such a crusade had always failed. Plus, from the perspective of local, smaller powers in the regions that were meant to aid and host the crusade, who's to say the army wouldn't turn against them in some weird twist of cloak and dagger politics and leave their lands sacked and despoiled, as had happened during the pillage of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade in 1204. Everything, however, was changed by 1395. Stories of Bayezid's harsh campaign in Anatolia was making the rounds with the return in Serbian and Bulgarian Christian troops, in much the same way as had happened in Constantinople, only on a much grander scale. The Sultan's constant marching to and fro from Serbian, then Bosnian, then later Wallachian, in opposition to Sigismund meant that no one was spared the menacing presence of Bayezid on their border. All soon grew to fear and loathe the Sultan, and were ready for the first time to set their mutual grievances aside. Everyone had a stake now in seeing that the Ottomans didn't dominate the Balkan Peninsula. The Republic of Venice feared the loss of their overseas territories of Morea, Dalmatia, and fretted over their naval power in the Adriatic, Ionian, and Aegean Sea. The Republic of Genoa, whose naval power was largely based on their ability to sail up and down the Danube River and into the Black Sea, sought to forestall the Ottomans from shutting down the trade routes and forcing everything through the Turkish Straits. And the rump territory of the Byzantine Empire, feeling the squeeze from Bayezid's blockade, knew their only hope of survival was to prevent being cut off from the West. The lesser powers in the region, those of northern Serbia, Albania, Bosnia, Wallachia, and Moldova, were well aware that they were simply too small, weak, to be able to resist an outright Ottoman invasion. And paradoxically, at the same time, they were populous, rich, and blessed with grazing lands so coveted by the Ottomans to ever be ignored by them either. So it was by early 1396, King Sigismund practically single-handedly, but also with a little good timing, had managed to bring together some of the major players of Europe. The powers heading the Pope's call and acting within this lull in the 100 Years' War were various principalities from the Holy Roman Empire, Duchy of Savoy, Swiss Confederation, Kingdom of France, Duchy of Burgundy, Hungary, Transylvania, Croatia, Wallachia, Knights Hospitaller, Republic of Venice, Republic of Genoa, ostensibly a political fragment of the old Bulgarian Empire as well, England, Poland, Aragon and Castile of Spain, and Portugal. The military composition of this Crusader army was as diverse as the kingdoms and nationalities they hailed from. The most powerful contingent were the French, Hungarian, and Wallachian forces. The French provided nearly 2,000 mounted knights, arrayed in the finest outfits, best bred horses, and flying banners. Each knight being in turn supported by 2 squires, a mounted horse archer, and various followers. The Hungarian and Wallachian forces provided well-disciplined foot soldiers, armed with long pikes, perfect for breaking up formations of charging cavalry units. But perhaps the Hungarian and Wallachians' greatest contribution, on top of their number and skill, were their experience in fighting the Ottomans for the past 5 years. They numbered together roughly 5,000 and were eager to meet the Ottomans for the first time on equal terms. The entire force, in what will become known as the Crusade of Nicopolis, probably numbered in grand total between 14,000 to 17,000 men. Contemporary sources of the time, however, or writing decades after the battle, produce staggeringly inflated numbers. One's head can't help but spin at the figures. 100,000, and even in some accounts 200,000. I'm not going to get too much into it here. Other podcasts have done a great job in European medieval military capabilities, But suffice it to say that the speed with which the army moved and foraging required for animals and men, there was no way the lands in the Balkans could have supported such an army without an extensive, well-planned, expensive, and complex system of logistics. Even the Ottomans aren't to be let off the hook, who put their own numbers somewhere between 100,000 to 150,000. With 2,000 French knights, mostly from Burgundy, 5,000 foot soldiers of Wallachia and Hungary, and a mix of 4,000 various other knights from Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, plus more footmen from Italy and England, and a handful of archers here and there, the crusading force began to arrive at their various assembly points to head out for the city of Buda in Hungary. The leadership of the crusade fell to a war council made up of 10 men. Their de facto leader was the son of the Duke of Burgundy, since it was the Duke who was footing most of the bill, the Marshal of Burgundy named Nevers. The others were mainly French and Hungarian with some Wallachians. Since there was no one official leader of the crusade, the decision-making process devolved down to social status, seniority, protocol, and consensus. This would mean that when a sudden change occurred in military operations, to get everyone on board would require the war council to be called and a decision reached which pleased everyone. As one can imagine, this was a disastrous recipe for the making of a weak chain of command that wasn't in any way unified. Already, the crusade officially embarked on its assembly areas. There were fault lines appearing. The French knights held a high view of themselves, and their opinion of the military capabilities of the Ottomans was nothing short of the grandest display of naivety, if outright stupidity. On the opposite spectrum were the Hungarian and Wallachian leaders, who were grim realists and perfectly attuned to the Turkish threat. These differences became a source of friction between the allies and eventually led to a breakdown in the chain of command that I will cover in Part 2. The crusading contingents all departed their respective home bases from 30th of April and arrived in small numbers in Buda, Hungary, 1396. As the Crusaders were assembling, the Knights Hospitallers, Venice, and Genoa had begun to sail up the Turkish Straits and into the Black Sea, and were headed for the mouth of the Danube River to sail up and supply the crusade. By June, the entire crusading army had assembled in Buda, and a war council was called to decide the next step. And that concludes Episode 10, Part 1, A Crusade Dies at Nicopolis. I promise in Part 2 of Episode 10 that our crusading army is going to get to Nicopolis and deal the Ottomans some setbacks. However, without giving away any spoilers, I think we can guess how it's going to turn out in the end when they go up against the Thunderbolt in person. I'm really excited, and I hope you are too. In the meantime, might I suggest you head on over to David Cott's The History of Spain's podcast? I'm on Episode 5, Second Iron Age, Iberians, Celts, and Other Pre-Roman Peoples. I love this particular episode because David summons us out of the prehistory world of the Celts and into our contemporary world, and ties the history to current political trends and Basque nationalism. Thank you, David. A job very well done. If you enjoyed today's show, please consider supporting the show by going to Apple Podcast, Stitcher, and Spotify, and by visiting the show's website at, all one word, Empiresofhistorypodcast.blueberry.net. That last part is spelled BLUBRRY.net, where you can comment and subscribe. Feel like supporting the show? You can stop in at Patreon under the show's page and make a donation. Any little bit would help. All proceeds from Patreon are poured straight back into the show in the form of purchase of books and scholarly articles on the subject matter. I've been getting emails from listeners asking how they can contribute to the show and help out, and although I certainly appreciate PayPal contributions, I would really love it if I could start to funnel some of the support into the Patreon page. But as usual, thank you very much. And if you feel I can improve the show, please drop me a line at empiresofhistorypodcast@gmail.com. Many, many thanks.